It started with a sound that didn't belong, a faint creak of a door at 2 in the morning. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe an animal, but when I stepped into the hallway, my blood ran cold. The light from the street lamps poured through the blinds, and there, standing in my living room, was someone who absolutely shouldn't have been there. It was her, the woman from the HOA board, the same woman who had spent months threatening me over mailbox paint, fence height, and lawn color. And now, she was inside my home. No permission, no warrant. Just pure entitlement, masked as authority. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. She froze when she saw me like she'd been caught in the middle of a nightmare. She'd written herself. What she didn't know was that I wasn't just another homeowner she could bully. I wasn't just someone she could write off with another fine or a citation. Because beneath the quiet life I lived in that neighborhood, behind the same front door she thought she owned through her HOA, power was something she never expected. I was a police officer, and that night, she was about to learn what real consequences looked like. What happens when the enforcer finally meets someone she can't intimidate? Keep watching, because the moment she broke in was just the beginning. I moved into Maple Ridge Estates for peace, not trouble. The kind of peace you can feel when you pull into a clean, quiet neighborhood where every lawn looks like it was trimmed with a ruler and every house glows under warm porch lights. I'd spent years in city chaos, so when I found this place, tucked behind a line of whispering pines and guarded by an HOA that promised community harmony, it felt like a breath of fresh air. My job as an officer was demanding enough long shifts, unpredictable hours, and more human conflict than anyone should have to see in a lifetime. All I wanted when I came home was normal. A yard for my dog, a porch to drink coffee on, and neighbors who nodded politely but minded their own business. At first, that's exactly what I got. The people here were quiet, reserved, the kind who smiled when you waved, but never got too close. The HOA board held their monthly meetings in the clubhouse across the street, and I never bothered to attend. My dues were paid automatically, my mailbox was freshly painted, and my trash cans never missed a pickup. I thought that was enough to stay invisible. Then came the notices, subtle at first, tucked neatly into my mailbox, each one more nitpicky than the last. A warning about the color of my porch light, a complaint that my dog barked too loud at noon, a letter about my truck being parked a few inches too close to the sidewalk. It was like someone had started watching me, measuring every inch of my life against an invisible rule book I never agreed to. The name signed at the bottom of each notice was the same: Karen, the HOA vice president. I'd seen her around mid-50, a sharp, blonde bob, clipboard always in hand. She walked the neighborhood like she owned it, jotting down notes about people as driveways or counting how long Christmas decorations stayed up after New Year's. The kind of person who smiled at you in public but made phone calls about you in private. At first, I laughed it off. Every neighborhood has a Karen, right? But it wasn't long before those little letters turned into something else. One day, I came home to find a photo taped to my door, a photo of my backyard fence with the words "non-compliant height" scrawled across it in red pen. The next week, a fine appeared in my mailbox. $50 for unsightly exterior decor. I looked around my yard, trying to figure out what she even meant. The only thing out of place was a small American flag I'd planted near the walkway. When I asked the HOA office about it, the manager shrugged and said it was against aesthetic uniformity policy. I didn't even know that was a thing. I paid the fine anyway. I figured it was easier than starting a fight. But that was my mistake. In Maple Ridge, paying a fine didn't make you compliant, it made you a target. From that moment on, Karen's attention shifted completely toward me. She started showing up unannounced during the day, pacing by my driveway, peering over my fence, as if waiting to find another infraction. My neighbors started whispering too. Some avoided me entirely, afraid of getting on her bad side. Others quietly warned me to just stay on her good side. But I'd seen people like her before, people who mistook authority for power, who got addicted to control. It was always the same pattern. First, they test your patience. Then they test your limits. And then they cross the line. I just didn't know how far Karan was willing to go. Still, I tried to ignore it. I focused on work, came home late, and spent most nights keeping to myself. Until one evening, I noticed something strange. The porch light I'd replaced a week earlier was gone and screwed completely from the fixture. A small note was taped where the bulb used to be. It read, "You've been warned." No signature this time, but I didn't need one. The handwriting was unmistakable. That night, I sat in the dark, staring out my window at the quiet street. Every house looked peaceful, every driveway spotless, every curtain perfectly drawn. But under all that order was something else, something tense, controlling, unnatural. This wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a stage, and people like Karen were pulling the strings behind the scenes. I realized then that Maple Ridge Estates wasn't designed for peace. It was designed for obedience. And the moment I stopped playing along, the game had begun. It started slowly at first, like a leak under a floorboard, silent but constant. Every few days a new letter, a new accusation, a new reason to remind me that I didn't belong. At first, I tried to brush it off. I thought maybe Karen was just overzealous, the kind of person who lived for policies and checklists. But this was something else. The letters turned to warnings. The warnings turned to fines. And the fines started stacking faster than I could keep track. $100 for having my garbage bins visible on a Tuesday. $200 for leaving my porch light on past midnight. $50 for inconsistent glass height. Every notice came with her name printed neatly at the bottom in those same sharp cursive letters. And each one felt more personal than the last. It wasn't about rules anymore. It was about control, about reminding me that no matter who I was outside these gates, inside this neighborhood, she was the one in charge. I remembered the day she crossed the line from nuisance to obsession. I had just gotten home after a late shift. It was close to 1 a.m. The streets were empty, the kind of stillness that almost hums in your ears. As I turned into my driveway, my headlights caught movement, someone ducking behind the hedges near my fence. I stepped out quietly, hand instinctively near my hip, but by the time I got close, whoever it was had disappeared into the shadows. The next morning, there was a fresh envelope taped to my front door. Unauthorized surveillance equipment on property perimeter. Remove immediately. My security cameras installed for my own protection were now considered a violation. I checked the HOA rulebook cover to cover. There was no mention of cameras, no clause against home security. It didn't matter. Karen made the rules up as she went, and the board, either too scared or too indifferent, nodded along every time. Within a week, I received notice that my right to vote in the next HOA election had been temporarily suspended pending review. That was the moment I realized she wasn't just enforcing rules, she was building a case. I wasn't just another homeowner, I was her project. I started documenting everything. Photos of the letters, timestamps of her visits, even the times she walked her dog past my driveway twice a day, pretending to pick up after it while peering into my yard. My neighbors began keeping their distance. Conversations would stop when I walked by. One Mantham, who used to wave every morning, stopped altogether after he got fined for having a flower pot on his porch inspired by non-approved design themes. Karen had mentioned my name in that meeting. I later found out she told the board I was a bad influence, someone testing the integrity of the HOA's authority. It was laughable and terrifying at the same time. The worst part, she was winning. Every time I thought about pushing back, I pictured her smirk. The kind that says, "Try it, you've already got the paperwork ready." Still, I couldn't just let her keep tightening her grip. I knew how people like her operated. The more you gave, the more they took. So, I started fighting back quietly. I reviewed every policy, highlighted inconsistencies, gathered statements from neighbors who'd been fined for absurd reasons. I filed an appeal with the HOA's oversight committee, citing bias and harassment. The response came 2 weeks later. Complaint dismissed. No evidence of misconduct. I wasn't surprised. I'd seen corruption before, but never this dressed up in politeness and pastel-colored stationery. One evening, as I walked to the mailbox, I saw her standing by the community garden, clipboard in hand, pretending to inspect the plants. She looked up and smiled that thin, calculated smile. "Evening, officer," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Lovely weather for compliance checks, don't you think?" I didn't answer. I just stared back until her smile faltered. That was the first time I saw something new in her expression, not confidence, not satisfaction, but something closer to fear. For a brief second, she realized I wasn't just another target. But the moment passed. The next day, I woke up to find my backyard gate padlocked from the outside, my tools, my mower, everything trapped inside. A bright orange sticker was slapped across it. Restricted area pending safety inspection. I stood there, jaw clenched, as the sun climbed over the roofs. It was pure humiliation, and she knew it. But if she thought that would break me, she was wrong. That night, I filed a report with local authorities, not as an officer, but as a resident whose property had been tampered with. I didn't list any suspects. I didn't need to. 2 days later, I caught her again standing near my property line, flashlight in hand, jotting something down on her clipboard. When I stepped outside and asked what she was doing, she replied with perfect calm, "Routine after hours, compliance survey." I told her she was trespassing. She said, "You should be more careful who you accuse, officer. It might sound like harassment." That was it. The gloves were off. I realized then this wasn't about lawn height or porch paint, it was about dominance. She wanted to provoke me into reacting, to give her a reason to twist the story. And the worst part was, she was good at it. Rumors began spreading that I was abusing my position, that I was threatening board members. Lies planted carefully, watered by whispers. Every lie left a stain, and the HOA started treating me like a problem instead of a member. Even the newsletter changed tone, with passive-aggressive notes about respecting authority and community order. My patience was thinning. My yard, once neat and welcoming, became a battleground of petty citations, unauthorized soil color variation, unapproved wind chimes, improper driveway slope. I stopped reading after a while. They were nonsense, all of them, designed to bury me in paper until I either left or snapped. But I wasn't going anywhere. She underestimated one thing about me: I didn't scare easy. Then came the meeting that changed everything. It was a warm evening in early spring. The board had scheduled an open session, supposedly to discuss future improvements, but I knew better. This was about me. When I walked into the clubhouse, every chair turned. Karen sat at the head of the long table, her clipboard placed neatly in front of her like a judge's gavel, her eyes locked onto mine. As if this was a showdown she'd been waiting for. The discussion started normal enough: new landscaping, trash pickup schedules, parking enforcement. But it didn't take long for the tone to shift. "We've received numerous complaints about one homeowner's repeated disregard for HOA guidelines," Karen announced, her voice smooth and rehearsed. "We take these matters seriously. Community integrity depends on cooperation." Then she looked directly at me. "Officer, perhaps you'd like to explain why your property continues to fall out of compliance, despite multiple warnings." The room went quiet. I could feel every eye on me. I took a deep breath and spoke evenly. "I follow every rule that's written. The problem isn't compliance, it's invention." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Karen's smile didn't waver. "So you're suggesting the board is fabricating rules?" "No," I said. "Just that some members enjoy creating them on the fly." Her pen stopped moving. Her mask cracked, just for a moment. "You know," she said softly, "people who don't fit into communities like this often find it uncomfortable." The threat was subtle, but everyone in that room heard it. I left the meeting knowing one thing for sure: this wouldn't end with fines or letters. She was going to make it personal, and she did. 2 nights later, my tires were slashed. No witnesses, no cameras left untouched. She'd ordered me to remove them weeks earlier. I filed another report. The HOA's response: "Vehicle incidents are outside the jurisdiction of the association." Convenient. I replaced the tires, repaired the gate, and waited. Because, while she was playing her game in daylight, I had started mine in the dark. I reviewed bodycam footage from patrol nights, pulling timestamps that placed me miles away from her accusations. I cross-referenced HOA violations against bylaws. I built a philathic, undeniable record of targeted harassment. What Karen didn't realize was that she'd stopped going after a neighbor. She'd started going after evidence, and I had more than enough to use. But before I could act, she made her boldest move yet. It started with a complaint letter, not from her but from the HOA president himself, stating that due to repeated non-compliance and hostility toward board members, I was being considered for forced removal from the community pending review. They were trying to evict me. That night, sitting in my living room, surrounded by those letters, I realized something chilling. Karen wasn't acting alone anymore. She'd convinced the entire board to side with her. She'd turned bureaucracy into a weapon. And now, she had the numbers to make it hurt. But she'd made one fatal mistake. She thought I'd play defense forever. She didn't know that I was done waiting. Because while she was busy writing her next letter, I was preparing something far more permanent. The moment was coming when she finally pushed to front. I'd be ready when she did. The next week felt like walking through a minefield I couldn't see. Every morning brought another envelope, another accusation, another reminder that the HOA could twist anything into non-compliance. My driveway had a small oil spot $50 fine for vehicular residue. A kid's ball rolled into my yard notice for improper storage of recreational equipment. It was absurd, but effective. Each petty rule was designed to chip away at my patience, to turn my peace of mind into frustration. But what Karen didn't realize was that every time she struck, I documented it. I kept a log so detailed it could have been a legal report, dates, times, wording, everything. She was burying herself in her own paperwork. Still, her methods were evolving. She started recruiting neighbors, planting seeds of paranoia in their ears, whispering that I was dangerous, that I carried a gun around the neighborhood, that I intimidated residents with my badge. Soon, I'd notice curtains shifting when I drove by, conversations dying when I walked past. The community I'd once thought was peaceful had turned into a silent jury, and Karen was the judge feeding them the script. One evening, I came home to find a yellow notice posted on my front door. Violation hearing scheduled. Beneath it, the details were vague, but the accusation was chilling. Endangerment of community members. I laughed at the insanity of it, but deep down I knew what it was. She was escalating. She wanted me humiliated in front of everyone. She wanted control so complete that I'd either leave or break. But breaking was in my nature. The hearing took place on a Thursday evening, in the same bland clubhouse, with the same fluorescent hum that made everything feel artificial. Karen sat at the front again, pen poised, pretending to be objective. The board members around her looked exhausted, like people who'd rather be anywhere else but were too afraid to say so. She started reading off her list of complaints, each one more ridiculous than the last: parking too close to a mailbox, disturbing the aesthetic tone with my lawn decor, creating an atmosphere of tension by refusing to engage with neighbors. When it was my turn to respond, I didn't raise my voice. I simply reached into my folder and placed a stack of documents on the table: every letter, every fine, every time-stamped photo, including several, showing her trespassing near my property. "You call this compliance?" I said quietly. "Because where I come from, we call this harassment." The room fell silent. Karen's lips tightened. Her pen stopped moving. I could see the panic flash behind her eyes. For just a moment, the president cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "Perhaps we should review these before making a final decision," he muttered. Karen interrupted sharply. "These photos are taken out of context." I met her gaze. "So is your authority." For the first time since this all began, I felt the balance shift, just a little, but enough to know she'd lost control of the narrative. The meeting ended awkwardly. No decision made. No resolution. But the silence afterward wasn't victory. It was a storm brewing. She didn't back off. If anything, she doubled down. A few nights later, I caught her again near my backyard fence, flashlight in one hand, phone in the other, snapping photos. I turned on my floodlights and stepped outside. "You're trespassing," I said evenly. She froze for a moment, then smiled in that unnerving, unblinking way. "Just making sure everyone's following the rules." At 1 in the morning. "The HOA doesn't sleep," she said. That line stuck with me longer than I wanted it to. The next morning, I discovered something worse. My mailbox stripped out of the ground, post and all, lying in the ditch. No note, no explanation. Just a gaping hole in the earth, where it used to be. I filed a police report, this time, not through official channels, but like any other citizen would. I didn't want to mix my badge with my home life. But that didn't stop the HOA from twisting it. The next newsletter accused me of falsely involving law enforcement in private association matters. It was a warning shot to the whole neighborhood: don't mess with the board. People started avoiding me completely. Cars slowed when they passed my house. Even the mail carrier hesitated before walking up my driveway. It was like living under a spotlight in a theater where everyone pretended not to watch. Then came the day I realized just how far Kiran was willing to go. I returned home after a 12-hour shift to find my front door slightly ajar. My stomach dropped. Inside, everything looked normal until I noticed the framed photo on my mantel was tilted. Just a fraction. I scanned the room. Nothing seemed stolen. But when I went into the kitchen, my coffee mug one I'd left in the sink that morning was now clean, dried, and placed neatly upside down on the counter. Someone had been inside. My security cameras were gone, wires cut cleanly at the base. That was when it hit me. This wasn't harassment anymore. It was intrusion. I contacted the local precinct, reported a suspected break-in, but without footage or witnesses, there wasn't much they could do. Still, I knew I didn't need fingerprints to know whose hands were behind it. Karan had crossed the final line. I didn't react publicly. I didn't even mention it at the next meeting. Instead, I went silent. Let her think she'd won, because while she strutted around, gloating in her invisible power, I was preparing the trap. I gathered statements from every homeowner she'd find unfairly, including the elderly couple she'd threatened over a bird bath. I pulled HOA financial reports and found maintenance fees that didn't match any recorded projects. I had emails once she thought she deleted showing she used HOA funds for her own landscaping and personal property adjustments. The deeper I dug, the uglier it got. She wasn't protecting the community, she was exploiting it. But before I could act, she made one last, desperate move. A formal notice appeared taped across my door. Final violation: non-compliance with community security standards. Removal from property to be discussed at emergency board session. It was signed by every board member except one. They were calling for my removal, my eviction from the home I legally owned. That was the moment I stopped holding back. He attended that emergency session not as a target, but as a man holding evidence. The clubhouse was packed, neighbors, curious, fearful, whispering. Karen opened the meeting with her usual authority, outlining how I'd repeatedly endangered the harmony of Maple Ridge Estates. But when I stood up and placed my folder on the table, the atmosphere changed instantly. I began reading emails about the misuse of funds, witness statements about falsified citations, photos of her trespassing. Every word was calm, deliberate, impossible to refute. Murmurs spread through the room. The president's face turned pale. Karan's hands trembled as she reached for her pen. "This is outrageous," she hissed. "You can't prove these claims." "I already have," I said. "And this time, not just here. Copies are with my attorney and the county compliance office." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush the air itself. For the first time, she didn't have a script to hide behind. I could see her unraveling right there in front of everyone. But what I didn't know then was that humiliation was gasoline for her fire. She wasn't going to retreat, she was going to retaliate. That night, around midnight, I heard footsteps again, slow, deliberate, coming from the back door. I reached for my phone, called it in to dispatch as an off-duty report, and moved silently toward the sound. The knob turned, then froze. I flicked on the porch light, and there she was, scurrying caught mid-step, her face twisted in shock and defiance. "You need to leave," I said. She didn't move. "This is community property," she snapped, voice shaking. "I'm inspecting for code violations." "At midnight?" I asked quietly. "You're trespassing." For a split second, the reality hit her, but pride drowned it out. "You think your badge means something here?" She sneered. "This neighborhood answers to me." I took one step forward, eyes locked on hers. "Not anymore." I called the on-duty officers, who arrived minutes later. Watching her face when they read her rights was a sight I'll never forget. She tried to talk her way out of it, claimed it was a misunderstanding, that she'd been checking for safety concerns. But the bodycam footage told a different story. She had broken into my home, and that one act, that final attempt to prove she was untouchable, became the proof that destroyed her. The HOA scrambled in the days that followed. Emergency meetings were called, statements rewritten, blame shifted. Karan resigned for personal reasons, but everyone knew the truth. The neighborhood that once feared her, now avoided her name entirely, as if saying it might summon her back. Yet, even as justice settled in, the air didn't feel lighter. It felt empty, like the calm after a storm that leaves everything damp and changed. I'd won, but at a cost. Trust was gone. Peace felt fragile. Every creak in the night still made me glance toward the door. Karen's reign had ended, but her shadow lingered over Maple Ridge like a scar that wouldn't fade. And deep down, I knew this story wasn't just about one woman. Control. It was about how easily people surrender their freedom when fear dresses itself as order. That is when I started asking myself the question that still keeps me up at night. How many other communities are just like this, hiding behind pretty gates and clean lawns, while people like her quietly decide who belongs and who doesn't? The morning after Karen's arrest, Maple Ridge Estates didn't feel like the same neighborhood. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy, almost guilty. Lawns were still trimmed, mailboxes still aligned, but something invisible had cracked. The illusion of order had shattered, and everyone knew who broke it. I watched from my window as neighbors who used to avoid my house now walked past slowly, stealing glances like they were afraid of being seen looking. The HOA board issued a short statement. An unfortunate misunderstanding has occurred involving one of our members. The board is cooperating fully with authorities. No apology, no accountability, just words meant to smother the truth. But the truth had already started spreading. By noon, half the neighborhood knew Karen had been arrested for breaking into my home. By sunset, the rest knew she'd been released on bail. That's when things turned dark again. My phone buzzed non-stop. That night, blocked numbers, hang-ups, silence on the other end. I knew it was her or someone acting for her. The message wasn't spoken, but it was clear. This wasn't over. She'd been humiliated. But humiliation is just the first stage of rage. What came next would be retaliation, and I could feel it building like thunder in the air. 2 days later, I came home to find something waiting for me. An envelope slid under my front door. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed in bold. Drop the charges or everything you've done as an officer comes to light. There was no signature, but she didn't need one. My first instinct was anger, then disbelief. She was threatening me, blackmailing me, still trying to control me even after everything. I knew she didn't have anything real, just rumors, twisted stories, maybe fabricated complaints. But in her mind, that was enough to scare me. It wasn't. Instead of calling her bluff, I made a different call to my attorney. We'd already been building the civil case for harassment, defamation, and property damage. But now we had something stronger: criminal intimidation. The timing couldn't have been more poetic. The HOA's quarterly meeting was scheduled for that weekend. And despite the scandal, they planned to proceed as normal. I decided to attend. Not quietly this time. When I walked into that clubhouse, I could feel every pair of eyes shift toward me. Karen wasn't there physically, but her presence lingered in every uneasy face and forced smile. The president tried to carry on the meeting as if nothing had happened, rattling off agenda items about parking permits and landscaping budgets. But when the floor opened for community concerns, I stood. The room went still. I have won, I said. My voice was calm, but it carried, it's about accountability. I placed a folder on the table, the same one I'd used before, only now thicker, heavier with evidence. For months, this board ignored complaints about misconduct. You allowed one member to use her position to target residents, falsify fines, and enter private property illegally. You called it management. I call it abuse. The president shifted uncomfortably. Officer, we understand your frustrations, but this isn't the... No, I interrupted. You don't understand, because this stopped being about me a long time ago. This is about everyone here who's ever been too afraid to speak up. I turned toward the audience. My neighbors, the same people who had once watched from behind blinds. How many of you were fined for ridiculous things? For decorations, for plants, for parking? How many of you paid just to make the problem go away? Hands started rising slowly, one by one, until nearly half the room had them in the air. A quiet murmur filled the space, relief mixed with anger. The president's voice faltered. We'll take your comments under advisement. No, I said, placing a recording device on the table. You'll take them under oath. Gasps spread through the room. I pressed play. Karan's voice filled the air, cold, deliberate, recorded from a conversation she'd had with another board member weeks earlier. He thinks he can intimidate us with his badge. Let him. Once I get him removed, I'll make sure the next one knows who runs this place." Her words hung there like poison. No one spoke. Even the ceiling fan seemed to stop. The president looked like he'd seen a ghost. "Where did you get that?" he stammered. "Anonymous source," I replied. Maybe someone on this board finally grew a conscience. The meeting dissolved into chaos. Members started whispering, arguing, deflecting. One woman stood up crying, admitting Karen had coerced her into signing violation notices she never read. Another man admitted he'd been fined 3 times for something she didn't like. The floodgates had opened and the truth poured out. That's when my phone buzzed. Again, a message from an unknown number. "Nice speech. Enjoy it while you can." The blood drained from my face. She was watching, somewhere. Somehow. She knew what was happening. I turned off the phone and slipped it into my pocket, forcing myself to stay composed. The meeting continued in chaos, but my mind was already elsewhere. If she was out there, she wasn't done, and people like her don't lose quietly. That night, the police called. A fire had been reported at the HOA office mall, contained quickly, but suspicious. The cause? Electrical malfunction, they said, but I knew better. Files, computers, archives all conveniently destroyed. Evidence gone. Karen was cleaning house. The next morning, she made her move publicly. A post appeared on the neighborhood social media page, an open letter written by her. "I've been unfairly targeted," it read. "The so-called victim is using his badge to manipulate the system. This community deserves safety from corruption." It was classic deflection, a desperate reach for sympathy, but this time, people weren't buying it. Comments flooded in from residents, calling her out, demanding her resignation, praising the evidence I'd shown. The tide had turned completely, yet beneath that victory was unease. The more cornered she became, the more unpredictable she would get. I stayed alert, slept lightly, checked the locks twice. Because deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Karen had lost her crown, but she hadn't given up the throne. And somewhere in that silence, I could feel her plotting her next move. The morning of the hearing arrived cloaked in a grey drizzle that turned every reflection in the pavement into a shimmer of tension. Reporters had gathered outside the courthouse, cameras ready, voices hushed, as they waited for the woman who had once ruled Maple Ridge Estates with clipped smiles and printed citations. When Karen stepped out of the car, she wasn't the picture of authority anymore. Her hair was unkempt, her expression a tight mask, trying to hide the collapse behind it. The irony wasn't lost on me after months of her invading everyone's privacy. Now every lens in the county was turned on her. My attorney and I walked past the crowd quietly. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with that electric mix of curiosity and judgment. Neighbors sat in the back row, whispering in disbelief that the woman who fined them for mailbox paint was now standing trial for criminal trespass, harassment, and destruction of property. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman with no patience for theatrics, called the session to order. Karen's attorney tried to open with a plea for leniency, painting her as a community leader who had simply overstepped in passion. But when the evidence began, passion turned into premeditation. The recordings, the photographs of the break-in, the threats, the paper trail of falsified fines, it was all laid bare. Every attempt she had made to manipulate me, every whisper campaign, every petty act of control, it all stood in the fluorescent light of that courtroom. Her facade cracked. When my attorney played the voicemail she'd left the night of the meeting, her voice, trembling with rage, said, "You think this is over? I built this neighborhood. I can destroy it too." The words echoed through the courtroom like gunfire. Even she seemed to flinch, hearing them out loud. The judge's pen paused, mid-air, eyes narrowing. Karen looked at me across the room, her gaze wild but hollow, the defiance gone, replaced by something close to Pharaoh realization. For the first time, she understood she had lost control. Then came my turn to speak. I stood, feeling the weight of months press into that one moment. "Your Honor," I said, "this case isn't about one bad neighbor or one bad decision. It's about power, the kind that hides behind community rules and uses fear to enforce silence. It's about people who were too scared to speak up because they thought no one would listen." I glanced toward the back, where residents sat, people who had endured her pettiness for years. All we ever wanted was peace in our own homes. She took that from us. But today, we take it back. The courtroom fell silent. Even the judge looked moved, her expression softening before she turned toward Karen. "Ms. Henderson," she said, her tone clipped. "You abused your position of authority and violated the trust of this community. The law doesn't grant you the right to play ruler of your neighbors." Then came the gavel. Guilty. The word landed with the weight of every sleepless night, every unjust fine, every ounce of fear she'd caused. She was sentenced to probation, community service, restitution for damages, and a restraining order. It wasn't a dramatic prison sentence, but it was justice. And more importantly, it was public. As the hearing ended, she turned to me, her eyes glistening with something between hatred and disbelief. Han whispered, "You think you won. They'll turn on you next." I didn't answer. I didn't need to, because outside that courtroom, for the first time, people weren't whispering about me, they were standing with me. The reporters crowded in, microphones flashing. One asked, "What's next for you and the HOA?" I paused, then said, "Accountability. Real this time." That night, the story spread across every local outlet. HOA president found guilty in harassment case. The online comments were a flood, some shocked, some vindicated, many admitting they'd lived similar nightmares in their own neighborhoods. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was bigger, a small crack in a much larger wall of unchecked power. Days passed, then weeks. The HOA board scrambled to rebuild its image. 3 members resigned quietly. New elections were called. For the first time, residents were talking about transparency, limits, reforms. The community began to breathe again, but Karen couldn't stand silence. Even under court order, she found ways to stir unrestrained emails, veiled accusations, little digital ghosts that tried to haunt what she'd lost, each one weaker than the last, fading like echoes of a collapsing empire. And still, a part of me remained on guard, because when someone like her loses control, they don't stop, they erode, they haunt, they linger. One late evening, I got home from work to find a small package at my doorstep. No return address. Inside a shattered HOA nameplate, the one that used to hang outside the clubhouse. Nothing else. No note, just that broken piece of power. A silent message. "It's done." I took it as closure, though I couldn't tell whether it was meant as surrender or threat. I placed it in my garage, on a shelf where it still sits, a reminder of how far control can twist people. But that wasn't the end of Karen's downfall. 2 months later, a local news station ran an investigative follow-up. They'd uncovered that during her tenure, she'd embezzled HOA funds for personal renovations, thousands siphoned through fake invoices. The board, desperate to clean its image, handed everything to authorities. Another trial, another public reckoning. When her mugshot aired on the evening news, I didn't feel triumph, just quiet relief. Because justice, when it finally comes, doesn't roar. It exhales. The following week, the new HOA president, an older man named Vitran, invited me to the first reformed meeting. He said, "You don't have to come, but it means something if you did." I went. The clubhouse that had once felt like an arena of humiliation now buzzed with cautious optimism. The agenda was simple: new bylaws, financial transparency, resident oversight. I watched as people who once feared retaliation spoke freely, even laughed. When the floor opened for comments, I stood once more. "Let's never forget," I said, "that power starts small. It's easy to ignore until it's everywhere. Keep it honest, keep it human." Applause broke out, not performative, just genuine. For the first time in a long time, the community felt like a community again. Later, as I walked home under the quiet streetlights, I passed Karen's old house. It sat dark and empty, a for sale sign swaying gently in the wind. The grass had grown wild around the edges, the perfect metaphor for what happens when control dies, life comes back. I stopped for a moment, looking at the window where I'd once seen her silhouette watching me. Now, it reflected only the soft flicker of the street lamp. I whispered under my breath, not out of spite, but closure. "It's over." Then I turned and walked away. But even as I did, I knew stories like this don't end with one victory. Across the country, there were hundreds of other neighborhoods where people still faced their own Karens, their own boards of control, disguised as order. Maybe my fight had lit a small signal for them, a reminder that standing up doesn't always end in destruction. Sometimes, it rebuilds everything. The camera would fade here if this were a film, my footsteps, fading into quiet pavement. The sign creaking in the wind, and the screen holding one last frame of the neighborhood returning to peace. But the voiceover wouldn't end with triumph. It would end with truth. Power only wins when silence obeys. And Maple Ridge Estates had finally stopped being silent. The weeks after the trial moved like slow waves through the neighborhood, washing away what was left of Karan's shadow. People who once kept their curtains drawn started talking again. You could hear laughter in driveways. Kids riding bikes down streets that had been silent for months. It wasn't an overnight transformation, it was more like thawing after a long winter. The fear that had once hung over Maple Ridge Estates was dissolving, replaced by something fragile but real. For me, it was strange, adjusting to peace again. The habit of watching every car that passed my house, every noise at night, it didn't fade easily. Even though Karan was gone, the echoes of her control still lingered in the corners of my mind. I'd seen too much of what happens when ordinary people surrender their power for the illusion of order. That's how people like her thrive, not by force, but by apathy. Still, the quiet had its own kind of healing. The new board worked differently now. They opened meetings to everyone, streamed them online, invited questions. The rules were rewritten to protect, not to punish. For the first time, homeowners felt seen. It was progress, but I knew scars didn't disappear. They just stopped bleeding. One Saturday morning, I was repairing my fence when my neighbor, a man named Tom, who'd lived 2 houses down, stopped by. He'd been one of Karen's silent victims, fined hundreds for non-approved paint color. We hadn't talked much before all this, but now he walked up, nodded, and said, "Didn't think we'd ever get to this point." I smiled and handed him a spare nail. Took a while, but we got there. He looked out over the street, eyes narrowing at the distant memory. "You think she ever come back?" I shook my head. "Not here. Not after all that." He nodded again, but his tone softened. "Still, she left her mark." He wasn't wrong. Even with her gone, the fear she built had shaped people. It would take time to unlearn that constant flinch, that quiet dread of a letter in the mailbox. But as the days passed, I started to see something else: the community rebuilding itself, one small act at a time. Neighbors who'd once avoided each other began helping with repairs, repainting fences, hosting barbecues again. The HOA, once a weapon, had become a tool for something better. They even started a community watch, not the kind that spies, but one that protects. And somehow, they asked me to help organize it. At first, I hesitated. After everything, I wasn't sure I wanted to be part of any kind of authority. But maybe that was exactly why I should. Because when people like Karen take control, it's not because they're strong, it's because good people look away. If I wanted Maple Ridge to change for good, I had to be part of that change, so I said yes. The first few meetings were awkward. Old wounds don't close easily. But each time we gathered, the tension eased a little more. It wasn't about control anymore, it was about connection. I watched people who had once been terrified of speaking up now debating ideas, joking, sharing stories about their families. It was simple, but it mattered. One evening, while sorting through the HOA's old records, I found something unexpected. A binder labeled Community Improvements. Inside were handwritten notes, Karan's notes, her ideas for playground upgrades, landscaping projects, even a neighborhood scholarship fund. I sat there for a moment, staring at the pages. It was strange underneath. All the control, all the manipulation, there had been something human. Maybe she started this thinking she was helping. Maybe power just twisted that over time. I didn't feel pity, but I did feel clarity. Power doesn't corrupt instantly, it corrodes slowly, until the person holding it can't tell the difference between leadership and domination. I closed the binder and placed it in the archive. Some parts of history should stay preserved, not celebrated. Weeks turned to months. The house that once belonged to Karen finally sold. A young couple moved in, a teacher and a nurse. Kind people, quiet, eager to start fresh. The day they moved, I helped them unload boxers, and when they asked what the neighborhood was like, I just said, "It's better now." They didn't need to know the whole story. Maybe one day they'd hear whispers about it. But for now, they deserved peace, without the ghosts of the past. In the evenings, I started sitting on my porch again. No more staring through curtains, no more checking locks twice. The air felt lighter, the world smaller, safer. The American flag still stood by my walkway, the same one that had once earned me a fine. But now, it fluttered freely, untouchable. And yet, even as calm returned, I couldn't shake the feeling that this story wasn't just mine. Over time, I began receiving letters, emails from people who'd seen the news, heard about the trial, read the coverage. Homeowners from other states. They told me about their own HOAs, their own currents. Stories of absurd fines, backyard inspections, and neighborhood surveillance disguised as community care. One woman wrote, "You made me realize I don't have to be afraid of my own front yard." Another said, "I thought I was crazy until I saw what you went through. I never expected my story to reach beyond Maple Ridge, but it did." And that's when I understood. The fight wasn't about one neighborhood. It was about a pattern. Across the country, there were thousands of communities just like ours, built on promises of harmony but ruled by fear. It wasn't just about rules or regulations. It was about control. And it was spreading. That realization lit something inside me. Maybe justice here wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something bigger. I started talking to people, connecting with others who had stood up to their HOAs and won. We shared stories, advice, support. It became a quiet movement, small but real. People learning how to challenge unjust boards, how to reclaim their rights, how to build real community instead of living under manufactured order. Maple Ridge became a symbol of warning, but also a lesson. Over time, news outlets followed up again. They came to film a segment about the neighborhood that took back control. Cameras rolled as kids played in yards, as people waved to each other instead of avoiding eye contact. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. When they interviewed me, they asked what I'd learned from all this. I thought for a long moment before answering. That peace isn't something you're given, it's something you defend. And sometimes, defending it means standing up to the very systems that claim to protect it. The reporter nodded, and that clip aired across local channels. It wasn't flashy, but it struck a chord. People saw that you could fight back and still rebuild. You could resist without losing your home, your dignity, your sense of belonging. You just had to believe that fairness was worth the fight. The night that segment aired, I got a call from the county police department. They told me they were starting a community outreach initiative training officers to mediate HOA disputes before they turned toxic. They wanted me to consult, to help design it. I almost laughed. Life had a strange sense of irony. The same role that had once made me Karan's target was now what allowed me to prevent others from going through the same nightmare. I agreed. Not for recognition, but because it felt like the right full circle. The line between law and life had blurred, and maybe that was where real change began. The program started small, just a handful of neighborhoods at first, but it grew faster than anyone expected. Word spread about what had happened at Maple Ridge, and people wanted to understand how an entire community could fall under the thumb of one person. They wanted to learn how to prevent it. I led workshops in town halls, spoke on panels, and listened to story after story that sounded eerily familiar. Fines for flowers that didn't match the approved palette. Homeowners ticketed for having too many cars in the driveway. Residents threatened for hosting family gatherings that disrupted the uniformity of the community. It wasn't about keeping neighborhoods nice, it was about control disguised as order. The more I heard, the more I realized that my fight wasn't unique, it was systemic. Every rule book that granted unchecked authority, every board that acted without accountability, was another breeding ground for a Kiran waiting to happen. And yet, each time someone spoke up, you could feel a shift. The fear started giving way to something else: unity. Ordinary people learning that silence was the greatest weapon their tormentors had ever used. Standing up didn't destroy their neighborhoods, it saved them. A year later, Maple Ridge was barely recognizable from what it once was. The fences were painted in every shade imaginable. Gardens bloomed wild with color, and neighbors waved like old friends. There were still disagreements. Of course, every community has them, but now they were resolved through conversation, not intimidation. The HOA had transformed from a board of enforcers into a council of neighbors. Rules were voted on, not dictated. Transparency was no longer a slogan, it was a habit. One evening, while walking my dog, I stopped by the old clubhouse, where the most important meeting of my life had once taken place. It looked different, now warm, open, with its doors propped wide for a community art fair. Inside, local kids had painted murals on the walls. One caught my eye, a large oak tree with handprints for leaves. Each print bore the name of a resident. At the base, written in small letters, were the words, "This is our home." I stood there for a long time, staring at those handprints. There was something deeply humbling about it. After everything, the fear, the anger, the courtroom, the legacy wasn't in what was destroyed, but in what survived. A community that had learned to find strength in its voice. The reporter who had covered Karen's trial reached out again that year. They wanted to film a follow-up, to see how things had changed. When they arrived, they were shocked, gone with the rigid lawns and uniform fences. Instead, there was personality, warmth, life. During the interview, the reporter asked, "Do you think justice was served?" I paused before answering. "Justice isn't just a verdict," I said. "It's the moment people stop being afraid." That's what we found here. It became one of the most replayed soundbites from the piece. But I didn't care about the views or the headlines. I cared that people were finally talking about what HOA power really meant, that they were beginning to question it, to hold it accountable. That was the real victory. Time went on. Karen's name faded into obscurity, remembered only in whispers and cautionary tales. Her house sold again after the young couple moved away and new families came and went. Life moved forward. But one evening, nearly 2 years after everything ended, I received an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single piece of paper, no words, just a clipping from a local newspaper in another state. The headline read, "Former HOA President faces new charges for fraud." Below it, a familiar photo, Karen, older now, tired, facing yet another consequence of her own need for control. I stared at it for a moment, then quietly folded it and placed it in a drawer. There was no satisfaction left to feel, only finality. Some people never change. They just relocate their power until it destroys them again. That night, as I sat on my porch, I thought about how differently it all could have gone. How easy it would have been to ignore the first notice, to keep paying the fines, to stay quiet like so many others. But silence feeds control, and every time someone chooses comfort over confrontation, that control tightens. I realized then that justice isn't always loud, it's steady, it's patient, it's earned. And sometimes, it begins with one person deciding they've had enough. The seasons shifted again, painting Maple Ridge in gold and red. Kids raked leaves into piles, neighbors shared coffee on porches, and the sound of life replaced the silence that once ruled these streets. The HOA now hosted movie nights in the park, fundraisers for local causes, and even community barbecues, where people laughed about the bad old days. The same clubhouse that once felt like a courtroom had become a place for celebration. One evening, as I stood near the grill at one of those gatherings, Victor, the new HOA president, walked up beside me. "You ever think about running for the board?" he asked with a grin. I laughed. "After all that, I think I've had my fill." He chuckled. "Fair enough, but if you ever do, you've got my vote." I nodded, smiling faintly. "No thanks. I like my freedom too much." We both laughed, the kind of laugh that only comes from surviving something heavy and finally feeling light again. When the crowd quieted later that night, Victor raised a glass and said, "To community the way it should have been all along." Everyone cheered. I looked around and saw faces I'd once only known through closed blinds, now illuminated by string lights and trust. That was the real ending. Not a gavel in a courtroom, but a toast in the open air. As the night went on, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Not the fragile kind built on control, but the kind built on choice. On people choosing to look out for one another instead of policing one another. And I knew, deep down, that no rulebook could ever enforce that. Only people could. Months later, I finally decided to move. Not out of frustration, but fulfillment. Maple Ridge didn't need me anymore. It was standing on its own. I found a small cabin on the edge of town. Quiet, surrounded by woods. The kind of place where the loudest sound at night is the wind through the trees. On my last day in Maple Ridge, I took one final walk down the street. The lawns, once identical, were now painted with individuality: flower beds, wind chimes, garden gnomes, signs of life, signs of freedom. As I reached the end of the cul-de-sac, I looked back one last time. For the first time, it didn't look like a battlefield. It looked like home. The new owners waved from my old porch as I got into my truck, smiling warmly. I waved back, and for a moment, it felt like I was closing a chapter I didn't even realize was still open. Driving away, I passed the Welcome to Maple Ridge Estates sign. Someone had added a new line underneath it, painted by hand, where community means people, not power. I smiled. That was all the closure I needed. In the months that followed, I kept hearing from people who'd watched the story unfold. Neighbors, journalists, even local officials who said that changed how they handled disputes. One evening, during a conference on community reform, a young woman approached me. She looked nervous but determined. "I started my own HOA reform group," she said. "We just voted to remove a board that was abusing its power. Your story gave me the courage to do it." That was the moment I realized the real impact was in what happened to MIT, was in what it inspired. A ripple that spread far beyond the borders of one quiet neighborhood. Maybe that's what justice really is. Not a moment, but a movement. And as I walked back to my seat that night, I felt that same quiet satisfaction I'd felt the day the judge's gavel fell. The same calm that came when the silence finally broke. The story of Maple Ridge wasn't about revenge. It was about recovery. It was proof that no system, no rule, no title can stand forever when people remember they have a voice. As I look back now, I don't see an HOA war. I see a lesson carved into the fabric of an ordinary neighborhood, a reminder that control only wins when good people do nothing, and that every fence, every home, every front yard belongs not to the board, but to the people who live behind it. If you take anything from my story, let it be this: never let anyone convince you that order is worth your silence. Because once you give that up, you stop living freely. You just start existing under someone else's rules. And freedom, no matter how small the space, is always worth fighting for. So when someone asks me now what really happened in Maple Ridge, I just tell them the truth. It started with control, and it ended with community. It started with fear, and it ended with freedom. And sometimes, that's all the justice you need.